So before we go into the next session, the founding director of the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, is able to be on a call right now with us, and he would like to bring us some greetings.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, let me first of all just say hello to all of you who have come together in this fusion venture in this particular moment in history here at Yale and with the center and our partners gathered. Some things are an idea whose time have come, and it's always good. I certainly hope to have been with you on today. Thank the team, Tony and Jonathan and Ebony and all of them who've gathered and been working the correspondence and putting things together over these past few weeks. I had all intentions of being with you. And then at 6:04 Sunday morning, I got a call that a very dear mother-like figure passed. And it's tough with me, my family, my mother, who's still alive. When you start losing people that have made you, when they pass, even if they're very, very elderly, it brings up a flood of emotions because it reminds you of the walk over which you have come and reminds you that you're not who you are by yourself. And I've been with the family today, and thank you all for graciously understanding that. The dean talked with me on last night and said he would share it with you all in this morning. I did want, before you went into this evening session, I've been watching today some in between the other duties I'm engaged in, what we see on the news, what we see happening, all of this back and forth over whether you're going to shut down, shut up, lay down, stand up, move forward, move backwards. It's just a curious spot. And I thought about it, Jonathan and Tony, in terms of a biblical metaphor, if you will. And that is, one of them was picturing Goliath like a force of authoritarianism. And the one thing that David had to quickly help people understand is that Goliath's whole point of living and being was to keep people scared and divided. To the point that they many times would rather face and fuss and fight with each other than face him. And we know that authoritarianism, even in its today, and it's always been one of its major tools, is to keep people afraid and to keep them divided. And you have to address them early on. But then I thought about, lastly, yesterday I was thinking about Jesus in the face of authoritarianism, in the face of the wilderness experience, where Jesus actually had to go in the wilderness for 40 days. And in some ways, we're in a political wilderness, if you will. In some ways, we are. But in that wilderness, the evil, the unjust forces ask of Jesus to do three things that seem to be what even authoritarianism attempts to do in every age. One was to use its power for the wrong purposes. You know, it said that you ought to turn this, you're hungry, so turn this stone into bread. The hunger was real, just like so many issues in our society are real. But the evil one said, use your power for your own benefit. You know, leave the whole purpose of power being used for the larger benefit of lifting up others. Then there was this request that you jump off of a pinnacle, jump off a mountain, and see if God won't catch you. And when we look at authoritarianism and the way it plays out now in the country, we see all of these things happening, things that are being tried that just to see if they'll work, knowing sometimes they won't work, but just the attempts to be grand, to grandiose, false pictures of courage are being put in front of us, trying to make people seem one way when they're not that way. And then we saw finally in that text saying, listen to Jesus, just bow down. And you'll get all of these riches. You'll get all of the wealth. You'll get all that. Just bow down. And it seems to me that authoritarianism always wants in the final analysis to get people to bow down. Rather than face issues, rather than go through the necessary sufferings that it would take to address the real issues of our time, our poverty and hurt, denial of health care, just bow down. Just bow down. And millions of people marched a few weeks ago and said, we will not bow. All through the scriptures, the people of faith are called on not to bow. But authoritarianism wants us to bow. Bow to the greed, bow to the power, just bow, just give up yourself and just bow. And to each one of these things, an alternative vision was given, an alternative word, another word. Every time Jesus faced this evil, he gave a word from God's word that offered a prophetic vision of how to use power, a prophetic vision of what faith was really all about, and a prophetic vision and imagination for why you never bow. And that's why I think a conference like this is so important. And I'm glad that we've gathered together, because the temptations are real. People are facing. People, pastors, pulpits, pews, are all facing. This authoritarianism is running rampant. It's got people scared. It's got people wondering what to do. Some want to just give up. I was on the phone last night, night before last, somebody just talking about that I never thought I'd hear out of their mouth. Why don't you just go along to get along? And that's why we have to do what you all are doing today in a real sense. And so I'm thankful. Wish it could be there with you as you build out and talk about, and also work at ways of getting it out way outside of just the four walls of Yale and the places there, those who are among you. But to remind people that there is an alternative vision for how you use power. And power should be used for the lifting of the community, not destroying it. That we don't have to put on false pictures of courage. There are real things we can have courage for, the courage to stand for a better society, the courage to fight for justice, the courage to believe that if we do things right, we can abolish poverty and really, truly have people can have health care and voting rights. And it takes courage. And then to have a conference that says there is another way, and it doesn't require bowing. It doesn't require giving up. It doesn't require just saying, okay, this is the best we can do. No, it requires us standing up in our time, because in every moment of history, God needs a group of people who will stand in the truths of love, hope, justice, mercy, grace, and all of those things that say no to the antics and the evils of authoritarianism. So God bless to all of you. I'm looking forward to seeing the reports and reading what came out of this conference and hearing every bit of it, and how we continue to stand together, because just maybe, we were all born for this moment. Just maybe we were all born for such a time as this. Just maybe God is trusting us in this moment to do what is right and to be a prophetic witness in the very times in which we are experiencing. So God bless you. Thank you, Dr. Tony. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to the whole staff and everyone that's there. God blessings to you all.
I would like to invite a couple of people to come sit with me. I'll tell you who they are and then ask them to come. And then we've had a lot of conversation here today with a lot of different conversation partners. I hope we can have a conversation that really invites everyone in a way that we're able to do some collective discernment about what we're taking from here. Because as I've been listening to people today, one of the things that's clear is that you have skin in the game, right? This is not an abstract academic conversation. You came here because you're wrestling with this in terms of how it touches your lives and your communities. And I want to take that seriously and let you know that on the other side of this panel, we're going to be in some dialogue and discernment about what we can take home with us and what kind of work we can continue to do together, because as Bishop was just saying, in every age, there has had to be people who would stand, and those people have been able to stand largely because they've been connected to one another and have known that they weren't standing alone. So that's the direction we're going in. Let me invite Nancy MacLean and John Witt up, and as they're coming, I'll tell you who they are. Nancy, if you'll sit here, because at some point John might have to go teach class, so we'll leave you on the end. so we, some of you have been here part of the day, some of you have been here all day. We started this day taking a look at the present through a mostly sociological lens. I think we were taking James Baldwin seriously. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So we've looked at the present. We've looked at the past. We had a lecture on German history in the 1930s. We've come back to the present. We've been here most recently, talking about how people are facing the present moment and challenges of authoritarianism in the professions. And I'm really excited about this conversation because we have two really great storytellers who are able, because of many years of study, many years in archives, both of these folks are really good at digging in archives and finding good stories, to go sort of back to another moment in U.S. history and think about the contours, the shape of authoritarianism in this culture at a different moment, and to say together what people did in response then. So Nancy MacLean, professor of history at Duke University, great author. I would encourage you to read all her books. She became, at least as I understood it, most famous for a book called Democracy in Chains. That's when I started seeing you on TV. I knew Nancy. I said, oh, Nancy's on TV now. She's written a popular book. And I think a book that really took off because people recognized this influence of forces that maybe they didn't know about, but that had been pushing culture and politics in a particular direction. Before you wrote that book, you wrote the book you brought, which is also the one I brought. This book just had its 30th anniversary edition, Behind the Mask of Chivalry. If you want to know about the second Ku Klux Klan, the Ku Klux Klan of the 20th century and where it came from, this is the book to read. Nancy wrote the book. So we're talking about authoritarianism in the early 20th century in its very southern, but not strictly southern form of the KKK. I wanted to flip over and read one thing you said here, and then I'm going to ask you to talk. Okay. But this is what I was thinking about. In your new preface to this, you said, if you are alarmed at the resurgence of the reactionary populist right, recall that knowledge is power. Acquainting yourself with an earlier model may equip you to better understand and contain its descendants in our day. reactionary populist right. You spent a lot of time understanding where that came from, what that looked like in the Second Klan. Just would you tell us that story, you know, in a version we can digest here and kind of work through together?
Sure.
I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I just want to say it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here in these conversations. I have been so moved by what people have shared and by the spirit that is in this room and the goodness.
There are a lot of good people here.
There sure are. There sure are. And I'm glad to be among you and grateful to my friends and hosts. As I go on today, you will also see that it's going to feel like I'm doing the American version of what Thorsten Wagner did this morning, except about 10 years earlier than the story that he tells. But so my book was about the Second Ku Klux Klan. Most Americans are probably more familiar with the Klan in the Reconstruction era that destroyed the promise of multiracial democracy that we had for the first time with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or familiar with the Klan in the 1960s, both of which were very Southern phenomena. The Klan of the 1920s was actually the largest example we have of the Klan, recruited at least 5 million members, and was national, although it was started in Georgia, was national movement, and actually had its largest membership in Indiana, because Indiana also had the largest concentration of the eligible population, white, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon men, right? And from that you can tell everyone else that they were opposed to, including, of course, African Americans with deep white supremacy, working people, Jews, Catholics, very prominently anti-Catholic, and also very hostile to the phenomenon of the new woman of the 1910s. So kind of a full spectrum reactionary politics of the kind that we see today in MAGA very much. And in calling it reactionary populism, what I meant by that term, meant to evoke, is the way that they would appeal to the middling Americans, right? The true Americans. So much of the rhetoric from the 20s is so present with us now, but so they had sort of superficial critiques of the elite and those they would call the silk hat crowd, but most of the enmity was directed down the social ladder at those they saw as not deserving to be Americans. So again, African Americans, but also immigrants, the so-called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, whom they racialized profoundly, and constantly agitated against. It was a movement that, by its very nature, evoked vigilante violence by calling itself the Ku Klux Klan after the Reconstruction era Klan, but also practiced violence wherever it could get away with it. Should I talk about the Christian nationalist part?
Please.
Here? Okay. So this was
There was
also
a religious element to this.
Oh, yeah. Remember the burning crosses, right? The symbol of the fiery cross. So this was actually America's first mass Christian nationalist movement. So much that you see in today's Christian nationalism is anticipated there, right? The notion that only Christians, and in their case only Protestant Christians, were the real citizens, had a right to control the government and the society in the United States, and that everybody else was an interloper. You know, Jews absolutely, not treated as welcome Americans, African Americans in the Southwest, Mexican Americans, and on and on and on. But they very much did use religious language, symbols, kind of evangelical and often fundamentalist theology were crucial to them. This kind of martial Christianity, this notion that we shouldn't be looking at the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Certainly not the Good Samaritan, but rather the man who drove the money changers from the temple with that kind of language. I just want to share because I so thought of it too when Thorsten was speaking, but a few quotes from despairing contemporaries, and of those, the most brilliant was certainly W.E.B. Du Bois at the NAACP and others, but there were more, I think, resonant perhaps for this room was a group called the Commission for Interracial Cooperation in the South that was black and white, and that was the whites still supported segregation, but deeply alarmed by lynching and deeply concerned about the Ku Klux Klan and the threat that it posed to the America that they understood and to the Christianity that they understood. And so This group was based in Atlanta, and one of its reports in 1923 said that Southern ministers who approved the Ku Klux Klan methods far outnumbered those who objected to them. This type of minister, the CIC concluded, has made the Ku Klux Klan possible. And then the director of this organization by 1926 confessed privately that the large number of, and he was speaking of Methodist and Baptist ministers, who are in the Ku Klux Klan renders me hopeless as far as the masses of ministers are concerned. So I think right there you see the kind of tension that Thorsten was describing this morning in Germany, where the great mass of Christian institutions, white Christian institutions, were largely silent, particularly Protestant institutions, because the Catholic Church was really embattled by the Klan, but largely silent about this, except for some local religious communities, some particular pastors or local interfaith organizations. So they were not distinguished by their opposition to this, and we can get into this more as we go along, there were always individuals, right, who were, and actually across the professions, including one that didn't come up today, journalism, there were people who were resisting this. Oh, can I say one more thing?
Please.
Okay, to the sister's point over here at the end of the last session, I loved your point about blue-collar workers and the questions of class and humility, and I didn't think I was going to get a chance to share this, but when I went back to my file on Klan opposition, I have all these old note cards and everything. But the United Mine Workers of America, one of the first industrial unions, which will be a good segue to John, the United Mine Workers, and remember they're, in their place like West Virginia, Colorado, et cetera, in a lot of places where blacks and whites were working together and where immigrants were coming, Catholic immigrants. The United Mine Workers would not allow members of the KKK to be in the union. And they had loyal union members go to KKK meetings to spy and find out which union members were in the KKK. And then they held trials for those members because it was an absolute breach of the most fundamental value of solidarity that the labor movement is supposed to be built on. And the unrepentant were expelled from the union.
There you go.
Anyway, the importance of including union and labor voices.
For those who don't know, that's the movement that gave us the song, Which Side Are You On? An important movement. And yeah, good segue. So John is here. John has written a very thick book. I hope you've done your curls if you're going to get this one. This The Radical Fund, just out. Congratulations. The result of years of research into one particular foundation that brought together a lot of people who were trying to figure out how to resist in this same time, not just the Klan, but many forces that were pushing the country toward authoritarianism. So, yeah, give us a little bit of the background of how you came to write this book and kind of what some of this story brings to the conversation.
Jonathan, thank you so much. It's can people hear me if I lean into the mic here?
It might help if you pull it off. It's a unidirectional mic, so you have to talk into the top of it. Yeah.
Is that better? That sounds better. There we go. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for inviting me here. I only got to catch the last bit of the last panel, but already I sense an energy that just is, I'm glad I came up the hill. I'm glad I came up the hill. And I apologize, I'm going to race back down the hill to teach. So as I listened to Nancy's really grim, daunting, harrowing story from the 1920s, I recognize lots of things in the story that I'm telling, and I also hear a lesson that has been really important to me in the last months, which is all around us we hear people saying, oh no, if something happens, we won't be able to go back. There are red lines. There are, we're about to go to a place where we won't be able to rescue our democracy. Our democracy, to the extent that it has been a democracy, has been in things much like what we're seeing today, much like what we're seeing today. And my hope is that we can find some resources in that history, both to know the extent of what we're up against, I don't mean to underplay it at all, but also to find some resources for ways in which people in our past, multiracial groups of great diversity, figured out ways to resist, as Nancy puts it. And so it's true that this big book, I have some cheat sheets for you, but it's true that this big book is about one foundation, but really it was a window into a world of resistance, and better than resistance, building, world building, to create something new, rather than just resist forces that were trying to smash interracial connections and class solidarities. The people that I found in connection to this foundation, I'll tell you a word about it in a second, were figuring out how to build something new, how to make something that could be durable and withstand the onslaught, the winds that would continue for decades, continue today. So what is this? In 1922, a little foundation got created. It's a Delaware corporation, because everything's incorporated in Delaware. I don't know if you noticed this, but they're in New York. They're mostly downtown, although there's a downtown-uptown thing. It's Harlem socialists, Harlem radicals on the one hand, and downtown radicals and centrist liberals on the other. It was called the American Fund for Public Service because they didn't want to get any undue attention. They just figured they'd choose as plain vanilla a name as they could. And what they did... But
you called it the Radical Fund.
I call it the Radical Fund because, I tried a plain vanilla name and my editor wasn't happy with that. So what they did was to try to figure out which kinds of social movements to support in their moment in the desert, their moment in exile through the 1920s. This is all groups that experienced themselves as wildly out of power, beginning in particular with the failure of the anti-lynching bill in 1922. There's a moment where it looks like the black constituency of the Republican Party can get an anti-lynching bill through. It goes through the House, and then it fails in the Senate. And from that moment on, electoral politics seemed like a lost cause to a whole set of progressives in America. And the people I'm talking about are the leaders of the NAACP, Du Bois, among others, James Weldon Johnson, whose papers are right down the street at the Beinecke. Go check them out, just an astonishing human being. But also Roger Baldwin and the American Civil Liberties Union, founded 2 years before. So it's groups committed to black emancipation, groups committed to civil liberties, and maybe most crucially, although we could talk about that, groups committed to economic solidarity and the beginnings of the industrial unions that will in the 1930s become the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO in AFL-CIO. And it turns out that in their wilderness years, all three of these different formations were around a common table, arguing with one another, learning from one another, sometimes bitterly fighting with one another over how to divide these resources and how to support a movement against the fascisms, and they were fascisms of their time.
Mm-hmm. And what did they learn?
They did learn to fight a lot. I mean, it won't surprise you if you put a bunch of progressives in a room that there'll be disagreements, and there were disagreements. Oh my goodness, were there disagreements? And I try to narrate those disagreements. I think they're really important to learn from. I would say that at the heart of their disagreement was an effort to figure out how to build new institutions that could be at scale. I was really struck in Nancy's, just few words here from this amazing book, which is a classic in the field. You know, everybody, when I was in graduate school, I had to read this book. Everybody has to read this book. Nancy told us 5 million members of the Klan, 5 million. That means that a little organization with 10,000, it's just at scale. It's not gonna, you have to be able to get in the 100 million Americans in 1920, 100 million. So if you wanna organize a politics that can do democratic work, it has to be in the millions. And so the discussion ends up focusing on ways to connect people in their work and family lives to one another. Things they care about, things that are shared across Americans at the scale of millions. And so there are ways in which class makes a bid, because class can unite people across all sorts of differences. Class makes a bid, but then come back to Du Bois and Johnson and say, wait, race is a form of distinctive harms that class can't capture. And so those are the conversations which we all have today, which they're having in the 20s from the very beginning. So it's, those are some of the kinds of conversations they're having.
No, it's great.
Could I just say, too, just to give you like a sense of the moment, I mean, it's important to remember that the NAACP was only 6 years old when the Second Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1915, too. So like when we're talking about this, we're also talking about really formations of what will become powerful and profound movements in our history, but really are taking some of their first steps now and grappling with these horrible realities. So much of what we feel now they were feeling and debating about then, as John shows so brilliantly in his book. But just to me, like, to remember that these organizations we see as like great grandparents now were very, very young and finding their way. And in that beautiful word that Carissa used today, getting their ethical formation, as movements. Just thought I'd pop that in.
One of the things I feel like I've learned from both of you in your work is just the importance of those networks that emerged through which people were debating and building a shared narrative, right? And I'm curious, so we've talked about your book, but Nancy also taught for years a course at Duke that I had a chance to visit on the insurgent South, you called it. And part of that was also identifying the many ways that people pushed back against this in local communities and union organizing and faith communities. So I'm curious from both of these sort of stories that you have told, what were the essential network building activities that happened that we could sort of tease out as something, a sort of practice for the present that we might need in a moment like this?
Yeah, so that actually became, this is on, right? Okay, my favorite course to teach, but I have to say I didn't invent it. I inherited it from great Southern historians like Larry Goodman might be a name that people remember, Tim Tyson, Bob Korstad, but we all had our own spin on it. But I picked up the story in Reconstruction because it was our first experiment in multiracial democracy and then crushed, and we don't actually get a democracy until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we know is in peril now. But I love teaching that course, not least because about half or a few more of the students would be, it was a seminar, would be Southerners, and often seniors who had never heard any of this history, right? So we would do the Reconstruction period. We did Ida Tarbell and the campaign against lynching, the populist movement and the moral fusion to which Reverend Barber and Jonathan speak so often, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the relationship between Pauli Murray, the brilliant legal thinker, and Eleanor Roosevelt. They had this long epistolary correspondence and relationship where Pauli Murray was shaping what was going into the White House and forcing these discussions that wouldn't have otherwise happened, and more thereafter. But today different people who spoke were talking about community and about relationships and about the necessity for, and Reverend Barber just spoke of it too, Bishop Barber, the need to keep people who have the coalition of conscience, as Dr. King called it, together and in constant communication and community, because we need to sustain each other through those dark times and difficult moments. And so to me, that's maybe the most important thing, is really paying attention to how deep some of these relationships were and how much people connected. And if you see their correspondence, how much they held each other up, in difficult times. And the holding up in difficult times also enabled the explosions and the possibilities of later periods. So, sometimes now we think about, there's a way that the civil rights movement is narrated as though it begins with Brown versus Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott, and then goes through the legislation of the mid-60s. But in fact, it was the groundwork laid in the previous years that was critically important, including the labor union work in the 1930s and 40s, some of which was interracial in the South at great cost, all the early civil rights work at Highlander and other places. That was so important. And there's a quote that I always hold close from the Southern Regional Council, which was another of these bodies that was inspired particularly by Methodists who were coming together against these things. And another group was the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, which came about a little later in the 30s. But anyway, as someone who was part of the Southern Regional Council said in the early 50s, before all these other things happened, that it is never more important to keep the conversation going than when it seems to be going nowhere, right? So, and now I think the conversation is going somewhere, but I think on those difficult days we have, just remembering, holding those values aloft, keeping those relationships going, pushing back against the horrors that we see. This is vital work, even, as Reverend Barber was saying, even if it doesn't seem like it's yielding at the moment, these efforts go into what happens later, as your work so beautifully shows.
Keeping the conversation going, even when it feels like it's going nowhere. It makes me think about Ella Baker, who was, as a young person, an organizer for the NAACP, and went across the South helping to establish all these little branches and meeting people who were concerned about these issues in communities where you couldn't talk very loud about this stuff or you'd lose your job and your house and everything else. There is no civil rights movement without that network that she had. But I often think about her because she's the one who comes along and helps King start the SCLC and helps the young folks start SNCC. And I mean, she's instrumental to helping all of the big organizations of the movement to connect with those people who she knew because of all those years of traveling the South. But I think about her a lot these days when people talk about how institutions are toxic. And I can't be part of this institution because it's too toxic. The NAACP was toxic. Ella Baker hated all of the toxicity. I mean, all these men.
And SCLC too.
Yeah, all these men running stuff. She understood all that. And she built, nevertheless, which seems to be kind of a theme here, this kind of commitment to building. I mean, I wonder if you could talk some about what you learned from these people about building in the midst of all the messiness.
Well, some of these names are circulating around the building that goes on in the story that I've tried to unearth. But a phrase that I encountered that moved me and I think connects here is the phrase used by labor organizers in the industrial union space in the Hudson Valley at a little labor college called Brookwood Labor College, which has Highlander connections, which maybe I'll get to. But the phrase was the activity. The activity. Sidney Hillman in particular from the Amalgamated Clothing Workers talked about the activity. There he is, he's got an industrial labor union in a period in which they are losing. They are losing. And what he has to do is he has to maintain the energy of his membership. If he doesn't maintain the energy of his membership, he has nothing. That's the power. That's the power that he has that he can deliver through the energy of his membership. And if he dissipates that, if he lets it drain, he loses the energy, he loses the power of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. And so what Hillman talked about was the activity. It was the constant engagement of his community around their goals. He wanted always to be able to go out on a strike, to have a credible threat. And in order to have that credible threat, he had to engage his community constantly in organizing of a whole variety of different kinds. And Brookwood Labor College was the place where the activity flowered. This is a place run by a former Dutch Reformed minister, A.J. Musty, a little Quaker tradition in between. Right. Amazing.
Here's a clergy
amazing
person.
Human. Amazing human.
Yeah, I mean, talk about that, because we have a lot of clergy here. Musty, I don't know if you've come across Musty. Musty is the founder of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the United States. But a minister with an interesting history, because he more or less gets kicked out of the churches that he tries to pastor. But he doesn't give up on the church. Not only does he not give up on God, we talked a little bit earlier today about the spiritual but not religious. He doesn't give up on God. He doesn't give up on the church. In some ways, the Labor College is his church. The movement is his church, right? What's happening with the relationship between the community formation, I guess, that sometimes, pastors, clergy, rabbis think about as like our responsibility in this institution. But I guess I'm saying that there are some new sorts of community that are emerging and people who are kind of taking on the role of shepherding these new communities that emerge. What can we learn from them?
Well, a century ago, those new institutions include these labor colleges, crucially. Right? There are no labor colleges in 1910 in the United States. The labor college is a 1920s development, and it's an effort to figure out how, in a moment of political exile, how to organize. And so labor colleges spring up all across America, and the foundation, the Radical Fund, it's one of its major sources of expenditure is on these labor colleges, in particular Brookwood and Katona, where Miles Horton, the founder of Highlander, comes through Brookwood on his way to founding Highlander in Tennessee. So it's That's one of the key institutions that can organize for the future. When the strikes of the 1930s break out, when the industrial Midwest starts to engage in sit-down strikes, and when the rubber workers in Toledo go out, the Brookwood empties. The faculty and the students all go, and they become the leaders, the informal leaders of organizations of workers all across the industrial Midwest. So what they did was they found a way to create an organization, an institution, that could last during that moment of those moments in the desert. And they also had ideas about toxicity. I mean, they didn't use that word. I haven't seen that word. But they had to deal with the fact that labor unions, many labor unions, were Jim Crow unions. Right? The UMW is an exceptional union in its cross-racial formations going way, way back. But lots of labor unions in the United States, until the 1964 Civil Rights Act that Nancy's written about brilliantly, have Jim Crow provisions in their charters, and if they don't, they're practicing it informally. And so what Brookwood has to do is figure out how to have a big tent. They're really in favor of cross-racial organizing because that's the model for them. But they choose, rightly or wrongly, they choose not to expel from Brookwood the all-white unions. They choose to have conversations across. I don't know whether that's the right answer or the wrong answer. I just report it to you from the archives as an interesting choice that they had to make, and it was one that they were torn up about.
Can I bring women in too? So one aspect of this new unionism in the 1920s, there was the UMW and things that they were doing in the Southwest, but John has written about the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. Before that, there was also the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and a famous strike in New York that was called the Uprising of the 20,000, which I did my senior thesis on. But anyway, it was, huge numbers of women involved in these textile strikes and these clothing strikes. Multiracial, Jewish, Italian, some black women, etc. But they were not welcome in the labor movement. At that point, labor unions, these AFL unions, also used to often meet in bars where no respectable woman would go, right? And they were mostly young women in those years who were doing these jobs. So labor education was partly also something that women in the ILG came up with to engage women and to have some of these summer camps and places where you could go, it was sort of a sense of like social mobility, becoming, their own kind of American, et cetera, but doing this. But I also wanted to raise a point about the KKK, which I neglected, and I think it connects to also something about Ella Baker that's really important, which is the KKK in the 1920s. We all think white supremacy, right? Maybe anti-Semitism, other things. That's not how they built power. The way they built power was talking about moral issues, speaking to parents' panic about their kids. Young men and women were going off in automobiles, petting, as it was called at the time. Girls were shortening their skirts in the 1920s. They were dancing in clubs and being too close to men in the view of these conservative evangelicals. The movies, were starting to feature things that were disturbing to these older Protestants. I say all that because it speaks so much to what the right has done in our time, right? So the Klan, their strategy when they would go into a community, first thing they'd do is recruit a minister that they could put out front to say this is a holy cause. Then they would recruit all these other people from the fraternal orders and stuff. Once they had enough people, they'd say, we're going to clean up our town, right? So one of the things I learned in this work is that you can never tell, but approximately half of the victims of their vigilante activity were not African Americans or even Mexican Americans, but whites who were accused of morals violations, right? Prohibition, violating prohibition, bootlegging, prostitution, adultery even. Women forced the Klan to go after their husbands, etc. But anyway, the bottom line being this stuff about family, about parents' concerns about a changing world and their children is like tinder for right-wing movements. I mean, you just have to bring the gas and the match, right? And so what we see in our time with groups like Moms for Liberty, attacking the schools, with, a lot of the other things, that attacks on trans people and particularly kids and this bathroom nonsense, this is part of a recruiting strategy to build power for a movement that is going to harm people, right? That is demonizing people, dehumanizing them in order to inflict harm, but portraying themselves as righteous enables all of that.
Yeah.
Oh, and that goes to the Rosa Parks, sorry. So some people, has anybody here read the wonderful book, I'm forgetting the author's name, but At the Dark End of the Street? Really, really powerful book about unknown roots of the civil rights movement in the struggle against the sexual violation of black women, and how many black women were, because they were not treated as women who were, going to be respected like white women and put on a pedestal, subject to rape, sexual harassment, et cetera, in some really horrible and dramatic cases. But that was part of the work that Ella Baker did before the movement became a movement, and Rosa Parks was hearing about these stories of what black women were enduring, and that was part of the fuel for the civil rights movement, on the other side, to reclaim that dignity, to hold people accountable, to expose this horrific conduct that was being allowed by the law. So, I think these questions about women, families, gender, children, sexuality, all of this is really an integral part of right-wing movements then, and fighting them, and then also in our time being aware of the power of these issues.
Yeah.
Rosa Parks, Highlander student, Pauli Murray, Brookwood student. The path is right there. And one of the things that makes America in the 20s a tinderbox is something for these right-wing moves, is something that you can see all around you, which is wild transformations in capitalism.
Yeah.
A capitalism that is in flux. Mass production capitalism in the 20s does to the textures and fabrics of working life something a lot like what capitalism has done in the developed world and the developing world in the last half century. Wild forms of dislocation that leave people worried about their children, worried about their futures, worried about the things that matter most to them, worried about their communities. And that's a moment where exploitation is ripe.
Yeah.
I wonder, so we had a conversation we heard a lecture from Torsten this morning. Where'd you go, Torsten? Oh, there. You want to come up and join this conversation? Let me invite him up. Partly because we didn't get to do Q&A with you, but at least part of our discernment here, I think, can be to think, like if we're thinking about history, this moment y'all are describing in various responses, a moment in German history. As historians, when you look back on these two times, what do you notice that's similar? What's different? I mean, as we try to kind of evaluate where we are in our moment, what can we learn from the differences between Germany in the 30s, the U.S. in the interwar period? You want to dive in on that?
Sure. How about two sets of things, two comparisons going on here. One is the United States in the 2020s. I mean, maybe much of the Atlantic world in the 2020s, if we had to be honest, but let's take the United States in the 2020s and the United States in the 1920s. That's one dimension. And then there's the United States in the 1920s, 1930s, the interwar United States and interwar Germany, right? Those are two different things. One thing that I would add to this conversation is the information environment. It is astonishing the way in which Americans in the 20s, in fact, people all over the Atlantic world were talking about propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. That's something that's part of our experience of failing democracies today.
I mean, it's not just social media?
It's not just social media.
Before?
It was radio, it was the beginnings of film, it was cheaper publications, and the power of powerful actors to control the channels of communication. So that's a real parallel, I think. A difference, at least in the United States, not so much maybe in Germany, although we could learn more, is Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, and Herbert Hoover were not demagogues in the way that we have demagogues in our politics now. They didn't take advantage of the mediums of communication in the way that actually that Franklin Roosevelt would. The demagogues are people like Huey Long, who doesn't end up becoming in national politics, or Father Coughlin, who plays a role in national politics but doesn't become an elected official. And so that there's a parallel, information, and a difference, the existence of demagogues.
So I will say that also, as with my historian hat on, for after when Trump was running, when he was elected in the early years, I really resisted the term fascism because I kept saying as a historian, no, this is a very, very different time. You know, the interwar period was after a massive mobilization, world war with these defeated powers, with the Bolshevik Revolution and the fears of communism, you know, an economic crisis that was devastating people. Compared to that, you know, it's astonishing how these ideas have spread in a time that is not such a crisis time. But I have finally stopped resisting in the Trump administration, and I think it's particularly a racial fascism, and I think that distinction matters. And there's actually one of the leading scholars of fascism, Robert Paxton, says in a book that's called, I think it's called Anatomy of Fascism, but he says in a couple of sides, well, you might think of the Ku Klux Klan, of the Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan, as the first fascist movement. And when I started thinking about that, it's really true. I mean, they are totally against the existing government, which they hate for its democracy and its rule of law. They're entirely engaged in this enterprise of, you know, dehumanizing African Americans to drive them from power, et cetera, and very violent, you know, all those other things. But where do I want to stop with this? So there are continuities in thinking, there are continuities in the rhetoric and the practices. I mean, remember the stuff about Springfield? They're eating the cats and dogs, and many people on the progressive side made fun of that. There were all these memes, but this is the language of people who, again, why do you dehumanize people? So that you can harm them, right? You know, as Reverend Barber, I remember quoting his mother saying, scratch a liar and you'll find a thief. You know, they're trying to hurt people so that they can take things. So I say that, but then what was I building towards? This is the problem of turning 66. There was a point there.
Later, if it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Fascism. Yeah. Oh, well, I'll also say too that, like, in the conclusion of the book, I talk about this, but the Ku Klux Klan preceded Hitler coming to power, but it didn't precede Mussolini coming to power. It was coincident with that, and they very much identified Mussolini and Hitler and these right-wing movements as kindred. You know, it was kind of a family resemblance and solidarity, and we're seeing that now again. You know, when J.D. Vance goes over to Germany and essentially supports the neo-Nazi party, the Alternative for Deutschland, you know, and goes to Austria to support the so-called People's Party, he's supporting neo-Nazism. And he's saying, welcome these people into the public conversation. So similarity, oh, I forgot, the difference. The big difference now, fossil fuel and tech. We don't talk enough about fossil fuel, but in my more recent book, Democracy in Chains, so much of the ugliness that we've seen, particularly from the Koch network, is about desperate fossil fuel corporations who are trying to hold on to this deadly source of power, much like the Confederacy was trying to hold on to this deadly enslavement of human beings and resisting getting rid of that. So there's that, and now the tech people. I think those things are different, but there are a lot of similarities.
So if we stick with the historical comparison, what do you think? Germany vis-a-vis this period in the U.S. 100 years ago, what can we learn?
I think there are so many kind of structural similarities that we can see and that we actually profit from analyzing. I had to think about one anecdote that I wanted to say earlier and that I think still fits in, that I really like. There is this guy who, in the mid-30s, I only know him by Officer Q, K-U-H, I don't know his first name, who realizes that he wants to become a member of the SS. And for being in order to be a member of the SS, you of course need to be able to go really far back and prove that you have no connection with being Jewish. And he knows that there is some dark secret about a conversion further back in the family. So he goes to what back then was called Breslau, and actually ends up having to find a rabbi that back then had been in charge of converting his great-grandmother. And then the bad news comes. He realizes that his great-grandmother converted in the year 1802. Now the cutoff was 1800. And then you have this future SS guy convincing the rabbi in Breslau to change the document so that it says 1798. And why I'm telling you the story is, it's not about biology necessarily in this context. It's very much about what stories we tell. It's about stories about origins. And I wonder whether that is also an essence of a connection that we can see there.
Yes.
That there are stories about origins, about where we come from, what defines our community, and that we have that in common. Something that we probably need to talk more about, but where I do see a difference is I think that the dynamics of undermining authoritarianism and these different elements that feed into it seems to be the difference between the role of slavery and that particular form of racism that is connected with it in the American setting versus the specific dynamics that we have in the German setting. So of course we also know that people who are black end up getting under pressure and some of them even being arrested, etc., in a German setting, but they are so much not in the focus. Right? In Germany, of course, it's so clear that it's about, and that's what I tried to show earlier, that Christians become vulnerable to authoritarianism because of their unclear relationship to Judaism and Jews. And that's a dynamic that really is central, so to speak. We don't get to engage with Nazism and the Holocaust without seeing that centrality, so to speak. And I think that in the American context, the dynamics seem to be somewhat different.
I think your point about history and the stories we tell is hugely important. Sadly, Yale lost a wonderful, at least from my perspective, faculty member this past year, Jason Stanley, a professor of philosophy who's written a lot about these topics, about propaganda and fascism and such. But his most recent book is called Erasing History, Why Fascists Rewrite the Past to Shape the Future. And he's a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and his father was also an anthropologist who he spent much time in Kenya growing up and does a lot of travel to Eastern Europe today, to Ukraine, and sort of watching all of what's happening there. But so the book is a kind of meditation using all of that history to explain why authoritarians feel a need to suppress honest history in order to create a mythical past that, as you were saying this morning, has no place for the people that they are otherizing and demonizing. So I think that's really important, and I totally take your point about the social and historical differences between racial enslavement, as African Americans experienced it, and the nature of German anti-Semitism and Eastern European anti-Semitism, which came out of a very different contexts.
But isn't one of the beautiful things about this kind of a setting is I hear people starting to look, not just starting, but continuing to tell stories that are counter stories. That is, because it's not just enough to identify the myth-making on the right. There has to be the production of counter stories, because the people who need to be organized will need to be populated with stories that make sense of their lives, that connect them to one another. So that is just a crucial storytelling, and this is why Jason's work is so valuable. Yeah.
And I will say too, I mean, that's another feature of our moment that I hope we do not lose sight of, is all the attacks not only on policies to create inclusive, welcoming workplaces for all to enable our shared, development and prosperity in the country, getting rid of 70 years of public policy that, was broadly accepted, but also the specific attack on knowledge and history. So I also do a lot of work with the African American Policy Forum, led by Kimberly Crenshaw, which has done a lot of work building up what's called the Freedom to Learn Coalition, and going into communities where books are being banned, facing the attacks on African American history, looking at the way this current regime, and by the way, I've listened to people who are focus groups and pollsters, and one way that we normalize what's happening is to talk about this as an administration. I think this has become a regime, and the semantic difference matters. But this regime is systematically going around to our national parks, and taking down markers that were developed by professional public historians, that marked Black experience or achievement, that marked, Stonewall. They took away, words from the Stonewall, all these places they're doing these things, and going after the National Museum of African American History and saying, no, you're making slavery look too bad, too harsh. I mean, that should set all of our red lights on the dashboard going and say, we need to speak out about this. We need to be running for school boards. We need to be writing letters to the editor, and maybe that starts to get us to resistance. But there are many things that we can do, but we cannot allow this rewriting of our history.
Amen. This makes me think about a lot of these people in this room, a lot of the people that come through a divinity school are people who are preachers. And preachers become community-based storytellers, right? And I'm curious, I mean, whether it's sort of mass communication that movements organize or storytelling that happens in educational and formational settings like congregations, what can we learn about the stories that have been told that helped us resist authoritarianisms in the past? What kinds of stories need to be told in a moment like this?
Germany has done such an amazing job of trying to deal with its past. Maybe, Thorsten, you'd speak to this?
I'm not sure that I'll be able to address it exactly the way that you put it, but what I'm sitting here and still thinking is, for me, the big dilemma of the moment as the European in an American setting is how do we manage to do two things at the same time? To face what Nancy just called the regime, but at the same time to keep a space open for critical self-reflection, to keep a space open to be aware of where are my blind spots? What is it that I don't see because I'm progressive, because I'm liberal, because I belong to the right side of history, right? Yeah. What are the, and these, I hate to break it to you, but blind spots actually are on all kinds of the political spectrum. I know that you weren't aware of that, right? So I think, how can I do that at the same time? Face that kind of situation that probably is new, but don't give up on that. And by the way, I will add, and I know that I sound like a continuous repetition, but I think there's a reason for it. That is where anti-Semitism as a theme is quite useful, because we suddenly realize that anti-Semitism can be on very different parts of the political and cultural setting. Right? Anti-Semitism in many ways can be a pincer movement from very different political sides. So I think we need to think about what weakens my and our position in that struggle. This is not a black and white struggle in that sense. We need to think about what do we bring into it, what is it that we don't see, what are our shortcomings, and then we will be stronger. And I think that's an important aspect of that.
This is actually good preaching advice for those of you who are, good preachers know that you're never the hero of your own story. So, find a way to practice that radical self-honesty that you're encouraging, but also to point people towards what I think in an earlier panel here was called, exemplars. I mean, there are ways that you can direct a community's attention to, movements that have brought people together, movements that have resisted. And I was especially fascinated in this, in John's book, The Radical Fund, about the way that relatively small group of people that had a little money to invest thought seriously about, like, how do you get those stories out there in a way that really changes the public narrative? Because I think we talk about this a lot these days. I mean, a lot of people are in communities where they feel like everything's being skewed by some algorithm that they don't even understand. And how can we think about if there are stories that need to be elevated, how do we work together and organize amplifying those?
There are some really interesting experiments going on right now about how to alter the algorithm. I mean, one of the things I think is most interesting is the little-known world of ad buying. Digital ad buying happens through algorithmic auctions. Many of the ads you see are coming through these algorithmic auctions that are happening, all bots talking to bots, and there are fascinating efforts to try to reorganize those things. Because what it turns out is that many of the richest companies in America are funding wild right-wing Christian nationalism publications because they'll pay for the ads. And so we have, and there are some really interesting experiments in trying to alter that, but this is the kind of infrastructure work for the infrastructure of information, which is what people were thinking about a century ago, different terms. They were thinking about how do you create a news service, a syndication service that will spread news stories to labor newspapers and local newspapers. But it's really the same thing, is how to get information that can make democracy work in front of people at scale, in large numbers, and that's what we're going to have to do.
I really take John's point. It's really important to always be thinking about that and reflecting. And I think Eugene really made that point beautifully today about taking some time for self-reflection and getting away from the rush. But if people, I'm always recommending books, sorry. It's my job. If people haven't encountered it yet, Loretta Ross's book, Calling In, she's a long-time reproductive rights, anti-rape, racial justice activist who she just won a MacArthur Genius Grant too, but wrote a very important book that I think speaks to many of us on the progressive side about this practice that has developed and become supremely toxic on social media of calling people out, of posturing as, infinitely self-righteous, and who can we take down because they have a chip there or a problem here, or they said something wrong, and this kind of demolition derby, and then people wonder why our ranks aren't bigger, when we've made an environment that is hostile and unwelcoming. So I highly recommend that book. As I was reading it, I was thinking all advocacy groups and movements should be reading this, and campuses too. But anyway, so I think that's a really good thing. Another thing I just want to lift up, and there's no segue to it, but I want to make sure we get it in. I get it in before the end of our day. But I just want to say, if we want to look at where a model of how to meet the moment in our country right now, it's Chicago. And I lived there for 20 years, and I've never been prouder to have had an association with that city. There was just a beautiful thing that I think I'll send Jonathan, but it was in Chicago, we run toward danger, And you think about it, it's a particular city that has a deep history of being an immigrant city, a deep history of community organizing, a deep history of labor, and people are stepping up. My old neighborhood, Rogers Park, if anybody's a Chicagoan, 500 people came out when ICE started raiding Clark Street, and they were taking, a tamale vendor who'd been here for 37 years and just grabbing people off the streets and racial profiling. And people are showing up. They're saying people are coming. Everybody has their whistles. They're coming out even with their pajamas on before they've brushed their teeth when they hear ICE is in the neighborhood. They are showing up. They are being with people. And there's all kinds of ways to do it, too. People are also, in the media. People are giving out cards, know your rights cards, to landscaping crews because ICE is going through wealthy neighborhoods like they're shooting fish in a barrel, grabbing up brown men who are doing landscaping. People are paying vendors they're buying their whole container of stuff so that they can go home and not be subject to ICE. So I think that we're really seeing there something that deserves lifting up nationally to say, this is what solidarity and love thy neighbor looks like, right? These people are bringing it, and we should watch them.
No, thank you for that, and thank you for quoting Jesus here in the Divinity School, love thy neighbor. And what it makes me think of is the role that clergy have played in that community. And I felt much the same when I visited LA a few weeks ago. The response of the community there has been incredible. But when I talked to clergy, it was evident to me that the Reverend James Lawson, who's the most important teacher of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, actually spent much more of his life in LA than he did in the South. And he taught thousands of people nonviolence in that community. I think about Chicago. I think about, Reverend Jesse Jackson didn't have a church. He had Rainbow Push on Saturday mornings. And thousands of people came to this different kind of community gathering every Saturday morning and practiced the tradition of keeping hope alive. So in so many ways, I guess I want to say, as we kind of turn to the room here, that I think we've focused on the role of clergy and faith today. I don't think that's ever a role that's apart from everything else that's happening, but I do think that it's always there, right? And sort of understanding how that connects to labor and how it connects to communication and how it connects to, grassroots movement building is really important. So I'm grateful to have these historians who've paid such close attention to, moments that we can learn from. We've got a room full of people that have been paying attention to this conversation all day, and I've talked to folks here enough to know that there's all sorts of ideas. So we're gonna have a little processing time after this panel, but before we do that, let me invite you all into this table. We don't have another seat, but I'll bring a microphone to you. If you want to join, actually I'll give you my seat. If you want to join, you can come up here and sit right here. Please, come on up. Come on up here. While you're making your way, let me just see if you want to be next? All right, you're next. But you joined the conversation
Do you want us to stay or?
Yeah, please.
Yes? Okay.
No, she's going to ask you a question. I'm just
No,
making it a little easier
I
for her to
got
be seen
things
here.
to say. We've just appreciated, I'm here with my husband. We're not clergy, we're retired, we're not professional people anymore, but we've been very active in refugee resettlement. And I'm sure a lot of you, because we're in New Haven, are familiar with IRIS and the work that they've done. Even though refugee resettlement has been cut off and redirected I can't tell you how bothered I am that these neo-Nazis are now going to be considered, politically persecuted and able to come in. So just put a pin in that.
Yeah.
But there is another group of people, the Afghan allies that we have stranded over in Pakistan, and there are opportunities for people to, you need a group of 3 or 4 people who are dedicated, who can raise money, probably about $12,000, and people can bring over and sponsor a family to, you just do all the social services stuff, like all the regular living, find an apartment, get jobs. So this is a very deeply personal thing that's just really changed our lives. And so the reflection that we need to do, it's hard to do that just by reading books. Mm-hmm. But the way that you can really make a transformation is by forming relationships with people who are not like you. And so just even learning what kind of food they need, what kinds of places they need to have access to halal meat, for instance. It's just really been a terrific thing for us, and you don't need millions. So we have resettled 5 families in the last 4 years, and I would just encourage everybody to learn about that. The one organization that's operational now is welcomecircles.org, and so you need like 3 or 4 people and a commitment to raise some money. So you don't need millions. You need a lot of people doing this, but there are people who have the ability to come to this country, and all they need is domestic capacity. This regime has gutted all of the professional nonprofit organizations, so it's really up to just regular people who are willing to do this kind of work. So I would just really highly recommend that.
I'm so glad that you raised that, Susan, and it also made me think of another group of professionals that maybe FAPSI would want to engage, and that is people in the military. Because as I heard those horrible stories from Afghanistan, and what those people did, and that they trusted the United States, to be there for them, they risked their lives, to try to build, democracy there, and then they've just been totally left. One of the things that was most inspiring to me was the military people who had worked with them, who are working very hard to try to get them over, who are horrified that the government has deserted them. And I know that John teaches military people, so maybe there's even a connection there, to find some of the people, because this is another thing about our moment and the regime. They are also trying to undermine a diverse, constitutionally minded military. Right? Trying to drive black people and women out of legitimate positions of authority to put in merit people like Pete Hegseth. Are you kidding? I won't even digress. But that is very serious stuff, right? And they are ultimately trying to undermine the Constitution to legitimize torture. We're seeing them doing the killing. And what we need so much is to have the voices of, again, constitutionally minded military members who are committed to a multiracial democracy to speak out, as some have been doing, many retired people. I think others feel queasy about it, but I think that for all these refugees, but particularly the Afghanis, I think that's important.
And they're not legally refugees. They come here with permanent resident status. So refugees, they changed the eligibility for Medicaid and for SNAP to say that refugees are no longer eligible for those benefits. And that's, regardless of the funding for these things, that's not coming back.
Now, thank you so much. This is one of the things you're raising is a very concrete way that I think people have always resisted authoritarianism, which is by building community across the lines of division that are imposed or suggested by a regime. And you've named one very concrete way that you've been part of doing that. There are all kinds of ways. Tony mentioned earlier, what has always happened in the fellowship halls, what happens, in the community centers, what happens in at the grassroots that allows people to know one another beyond these divisive narratives. I think it's hugely important. Did you want to get a question in?
Well, I do have a question. I also, since we're plugging organizations, I'll just, on the immigration front, so 2 little resources that might be helpful, whether you're out protesting, if you're being detained because of racial profiling, or work with any immigrants. Human Rights First developed an app called Ready Now that allows you to hold the button in the app for 3 seconds, and it will send a bunch of text messages to the people you set up in your phone with information saying, I've been detained, I need such and such medicine. You can set up care instructions for your pets, and let people know very quickly that they need to start calling. You can text your lawyer. It sends out all these texts at once, so it's a great resource. Ready Now. It's on Google Play Store, App Store, everything. It's free, obviously. The second one is Know Your Rights red cards that you can print at home and keep in your wallet. They look just like this it's probably pretty small for many of you back there, but it lists your rights and also has information for you to say or hand to an immigration or police officer. So this is not just immigration context, it's any of your rights. I'm a lawyer, and if I were detained, I would probably be a little freaked out and short on words, so this just helps you with some bullet points about what your rights are. Anyways, my question is, I think both because I'm glad Torsten's up there, because your panels were different themes, obviously, but I think there's also kind of 2 sides of the spectrum on the way that we look at history. We're kind of represented also in the kind of cultural attitudes, I think, of some German historians versus American, how we deal with resistance movements and how we look to them. In Torsten's presentation, obviously he was mostly talking about complicity and not resistance, but I think there's an impulse in the European sense to look at the resistance and say, but it was very few people, it wasn't that many people, and that's true also of American resistance movements, that they were by and large a minority until they swayed the public. I think that the kind of competing impulses in history do we look at the unprogressive majority or the resistant minority that won? You see pushback against looking at the unprogressive majority's faults from the right wing, saying that this is unfair. I wonder, how do you balance those in your history practices? How do you view, how can we deal with our illiberal, backwards histories in a way that celebrates our progress and is honest about our past while kind of building that big tent that we want and getting people on board?
Yeah, I think, John was going to speak too, I think, from history.
Can I just add one thing to that, which is what's really motivated me recently has been the people, the first they came, the poem that was from the minister in Nazi Germany who didn't speak up in time. And that story afterwards, that reckoning afterwards of what they didn't do, I found that very motivating in this moment.
It's a great question you ask. I never felt in reading the archives, reading the histories of the social movements that I was reading about, that I was writing about a minority. I felt like I was writing about organizations that were finding ways to give voice to overwhelming majorities of people, people who were voiceless, who may have been confused. I'm confused all the way. Of course, people are confused about how to articulate their values in difficult, rapidly changing situations. But organizations that were aimed to represent tens of millions of Americans, because that's what it had to do in order to win in a democracy, those didn't feel like minority movements to me. And so I think it was about giving voice rather than swaying, That is finding ways to give voice to an inarticulate sense of solidarity, maybe one that ran through religion in a bunch of ways. So that's how I felt.
To your point, though, I think it's also true that most social movements are minority movements. I mean, the number of people who are involved in SMIC was really, really tiny relative to the country as a whole, and I think that's something that we can take encouragement from. You know, you don't have to have the overwhelming majority to really, really change the conversation and begin to create momentum. I knew I was going to find a way to get this quote from the manuscript. I didn't compare it against the final book, but from Reverend Barber and Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove's book, this quote I absolutely love. The billions of dollars that have been invested to divide us may seem overwhelming, but I've come to believe they are a sign of our strength. Nobody fights you this hard if they don't think you can win. That pretty much captures it, and the point that you were just making. And we have to remember that through all of this period, the South disenfranchised its overwhelming population, right? I mean, African Americans faced tremendous violence in some places if they tried to vote, but also they were disenfranchising white working class people. I mean, the districts that people like John Eastland, who sat on the Judiciary Committee and overruled all the civil rights legislation, he answered to, I'm going to lie, I'm going to pick a number. He answered to like 26 people in a district of 4,000. I mean, that's not the exact number, but it speaks to the fact that hardly anyone could vote in the districts of these Southern members of Congress who had such tremendous power because of disenfranchisement, right? So I do believe, as John's saying, we actually have a much better country and a much better people than sometimes we realize, and that's precisely why they have to work so hard to divide and to disenfranchise and disempower us.
We're coming to the end of our time. You get the last word.
Ooh, okay. I'll just add a footnote to Liz's wonderful question. Two things came to my mind. Somebody earlier asked me, but you didn't talk enough about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I said, yeah, I know. Because that is part of that dynamics, right, in the German-European setting, that there is a temptation by now globally, and by the way, just look at what a certain Metaxas reading has done with Bonhoeffer, right? So that's a whole different discussion we haven't gone into. But there's the temptation, of course, to look through this one person and then in that light to reinterpret your own past. And that's, of course, why I think that's so not helpful, right, to have this big exception. The other story that I then will finish with is a guy called Harald Welzer, 20 years ago, did a fascinating project. He went in and interviewed hundreds of German families, West German families. The criterion was, I want to find people who are not victims and not obviously perpetrators of mass crimes in Nazi Germany. And I want to talk with 3 or 4 generations in the families. And the project was, he wanted to try to find out how do people talk about the past in their families. And in many ways, he just found a lot of evidence of what you probably could have come up with intuitively, but that's what scholarship sometimes is. And what he shows is that the same, in this case, Germans 10, 20 years ago, who, especially also younger ones, clearly know quite a substantial amount about Nazi crimes and condemn it, are confident that their grandparents were heroes and resistance fighters. So perhaps that is a place to end. There is a tension, a natural tension, to have relatively clear, assertive condemnations about what we know cognitively and how we feel about our families. And that's a tension that can be very useful, again, to move this closer to us, not to push it away, I'm going back to my blind spots, but to allow it closer to us, what our personal, family-wise or otherwise connections to these issues are.
Please join me in thanking all of our friends here.